Welcome to deep science sleep. Close your eyes now and let your body sink deeper into whatever surface is supporting you. Feel the gentle weight of the blanket against your skin. Notice the cool air moving in and out of your lungs. Hear the subtle sounds of the world settling into nighttime quiet. Your brain is doing something extraordinary right now, something it does every single moment of your waking life, but that you almost never consciously notice. It's taking all of these separate sensations, these fragments of touch and temperature and sound and movement, and weaving them together into a seamless, unified experience of being you, right here, right now. This is perception, the miraculous process by which your brain transforms electrical signals into the rich, textured reality of your conscious experience. Tonight, as you drift towards sleep, we're going to explore the fascinating, calming mysteries of how your brain creates your world. Let these facts wash over you gently, like waves on a shore, carrying you deeper into restful sleep with each breath you take. The architecture of perception, how your brain constructs reality. Your brain, at this very moment, is performing a feat of engineering so complex that no computer on Earth can truly replicate it. Every second, billions of signals are streaming into your nervous system from every corner of your body. Photons of light are striking the photoreceptors in your retinas, creating cascades of chemical reactions. Vibrations in the air are moving the tiny hair cells in your cochlea, generating electrical impulses. Pressure sensors in your skin are firing off messages about the texture of your sheets, the temperature of the air, the position of every joint and muscle in your body. This is the raw material of sensation, and it arrives in your brain as nothing more than patterns of electrical activity, spikes of voltage traveling along networks of neurons. But here's the remarkable thing that should help you relax into sleep. Your brain doesn't simply record this information like a camera or a microphone. Instead, it actively constructs your experience of reality, building it from the ground up, piece by piece, in a process so seamless that you never notice it happening. The journey from sensation to perception is one of the most beautiful processes in all of nature, unfolding continuously throughout your life without any conscious effort on your part. Let's follow this journey together, starting from the moment a sensation first reaches your brain. When light enters your eyes, it first strikes the retina at the back of each eye, where approximately 130 million photoreceptor cells convert photons into neural signals. These signals don't go directly to your visual cortex, though. First, they pass through a structure deep in the center of your brain called the thalamus, often described as the brain's relay station. The thalamus acts as a kind of gatekeeper, deciding which sensory information is important enough to pass along to the cortex for conscious processing. This filtering process is absolutely essential because your brain simply cannot process all of the sensory information it receives. Scientists estimate that your sensory organs send something like 11 million pieces of information to your brain every second, but your conscious mind can only handle about 40 bits of information per second. Think about that ratio for a moment and let it amaze you, 11 million down to 40. Your brain must be ruthlessly selective, filtering out the vast majority of incoming signals and only allowing the most relevant information to reach your awareness. This is actually a deeply comforting thought as you prepare for sleep. Your brain is designed to ignore most of what's happening around you, to let the vast majority of sensations simply pass by without disturbing your conscious mind. This natural ability to filter and ignore is what allows you to fall asleep even when there are sounds in your environment, even when there's light pressing against your eyelids, even when there are countless sensations throughout your body. Your brain knows how to let things go, how to decide that certain information doesn't need your attention, and this same ability is helping you drift towards sleep right now. After passing through the thalamus, sensory information arrives at specialized regions of the cerebral cortex, the wrinkled outer layer of your brain where most of your conscious perception happens. Different types of sensory information go to different cortical areas. Visual information travels to the occipital lobe at the back of your head, where the primary visual cortex begins the work of analyzing shapes, colors, movements, and spatial relationships. Auditory information goes to the temporal lobes on the sides of your head, where the auditory cortex processes sounds. Touch and body sensation information goes to a strip of cortex called the somatosensory cortex, which runs like a headband across the top of your brain from ear to ear. But even within these primary sensory areas, the processing is far from simple. Take the visual system, which neuroscientists understand better than any other sensory system. When visual information arrives at the primary visual cortex, known as V1, it doesn't arrive as a complete picture. Instead, it arrives as fragments with different groups of neurons responding to different features of the visual scene. Some neurons respond only to vertical lines, others only to horizontal lines, still others to diagonal lines at various angles. Some neurons respond to edges where light meets dark, others to specific colors, still others to movement in particular directions. The primary visual cortex is organized in a remarkably elegant way. It contains what neuroscientists call ocular dominance columns, alternating stripes of neurons that respond preferentially to input from either the left eye or the right eye. It also contains orientation columns, where neurons that prefer similar line orientations cluster together. And there are blobs and interblobs, regions that specialize in processing color or form. All of this organization allows the visual cortex to decompose the visual scene into its component features, analyzing each aspect separately before recombining them into the unified visual experience you have. And this pattern repeats beyond the primary visual cortex. Visual information flows forward through a series of additional visual areas, each one extracting more complex and abstract features from the scene. Area V2 processes more complex shapes and patterns. Area V4 is particularly involved in color perception and intermediate complexity shapes. Area V5, also called MT for middle temporal, specializes in processing motion. And as information flows farther forward into the temporal lobe, neurons become responsive to increasingly specific and meaningful stimuli. In the infratemporal cortex, there are even neurons that respond selectively to faces, and within that region, different neurons respond to different views of faces or different facial expressions. This hierarchical organization of visual processing is one of the brain's most elegant solutions to the problem of making sense of the visual world. At the earliest stages in the retina and in V1, the representation is still quite close to the raw input, with neurons responding to simple features like spots of light and dark, edges at various orientations, and basic color contrasts. But as you move forward through the visual hierarchy, the representations become increasingly abstract, increasingly removed from the raw sensory input, and increasingly meaningful. In area V2, neurons begin to respond to combinations of edges that form corners and junctions, to patterns of texture and regularity, to boundaries between regions of different visual properties. In V4, neurons respond to specific color combinations and to moderately complex shapes like stars or curved contours. In MT, neurons track the direction and speed of motion, comparing activity across time to detect when something in the visual field is moving rather than staying still. And farther forward still, in the temporal lobe's object recognition areas, neurons respond to whole objects, to categories like faces or hands or houses or animals. The specialization of these different visual areas means that damage to specific parts of the visual system can create very selective perceptual deficits. Someone with damage to V4 might lose much of their color vision, seeing the world in shades of gray, while still perceiving shapes and motion normally. Someone with damage to MT might lose the perception of smooth motion, seeing the world as a series of still frames like an old-fashioned movie with a very slow frame rate. Someone with damage to face-selective regions in the temporal lobe might develop prosopagnosia, face blindness, unable to recognize faces including their own reflection, while still recognizing objects and scenes normally. These selective deficits reveal that perception is not a single, unified process but rather a collection of many specialized processes working in parallel. Your unified visual experience is an integration of outputs from all of these specialized systems. When one system fails, the others continue working, demonstrating that they operate at least partly independently of each other. The visual hierarchy also involves two major processing streams that diverge after V1 and follow somewhat different paths through the cortex. The ventral stream, flowing downward through the temporal lobe, is often called the what pathway because it's primarily concerned with identifying what objects are, recognizing their shapes and features, determining their meanings. The dorsal stream, flowing upward through the parietal lobe, is often called the where or how pathway because it's primarily concerned with determining where objects are in space and how to interact with them through action. These two streams work together in normal perception, but they can be dissociated by brain damage or in certain illusions, revealing that they process information somewhat differently. The ventral stream is more sensitive to fine details of shape and appearance, more influenced by context and top-down knowledge, more involved in conscious recognition and categorization. The dorsal stream is more concerned with spatial relationships and motor control, faster and more automatic, sometimes operating without conscious awareness. This division of labor between streams allows your brain to simultaneously answer different questions about visual input. What is that object? Where is it located? How should I reach for it? These questions are processed in parallel by different pathways, then integrated to produce your unified experience and guide your behavior. And all of this complexity, all of this parallel processing and integration happens automatically and effortlessly as you look at the world around you. This hierarchical processing, from simple features to complex objects and meanings, is a fundamental principle of how your brain creates perception. At each level, neurons combine information from the level below to detect more sophisticated patterns and relationships. Simple features combine into edges and contours. Edges and contours combine into shapes and surfaces. Shapes and surfaces combine into objects and scenes. And somehow, through this cascade of processing, the electrical signals that started as photons hitting your retina become your conscious visual experience of the world. Similar hierarchical processing occurs in other sensory systems as well. In the auditory system, the primary auditory cortex analyzes basic sound features like frequency, loudness, and timing, then passes information forward to areas that process more complex sound patterns, speech sounds, music, and the emotional content of sounds. In the somatosensory system, the primary somatosensory cortex creates a detailed map of your body surface, with different regions of cortex corresponding to different body parts, then passes information forward to areas that process more complex tactile patterns and the meanings of touch. But here's something particularly fascinating that should help lull you towards sleep. This entire process of building up perception from simple features to complex meanings happens entirely without your conscious awareness or effort. You never experience the individual features being detected by early sensory areas. You never consciously combine edges into shapes or shapes into objects. Instead, what reaches your awareness is the finished product, the fully constructed percept of a unified, meaningful world. This automatic, effortless nature of perception is one of its most calming aspects. Your brain handles all of this complexity for you, continuously and seamlessly, requiring no attention or intention on your part. Even as you lie here now, drifting towards sleep, your brain is still processing sensory information, still filtering and selecting, still constructing your experience of this moment. But increasingly, as sleep approaches, your brain is deciding that less and less of this information needs to reach your conscious awareness. The sounds of the night can continue around you. The sensations in your body can continue to arise, but your brain simply allows them to remain below the threshold of consciousness, letting you slip into the quiet darkness of sleep. The brain areas that are most critical for conscious perception are located in the prefrontal cortex, the region right behind your forehead. The prefrontal cortex acts as a kind of executive control center, determining which sensory information is relevant to your current goals and should be amplified and made conscious, and which information can be ignored and filtered out. When you're awake and alert, the prefrontal cortex maintains strong connections with sensory areas, keeping you engaged with your environment. But as you transition towards sleep, the activity in the prefrontal cortex gradually decreases, and these connections weaken. Your brain loosens its grip on sensory information, allowing perception to fade into the background as consciousness dims. This fading of perception is a natural, gentle process that happens every night as you fall asleep. The sensory world doesn't disappear suddenly. Instead, it gradually becomes less vivid, less demanding of your attention, less distinct. Sounds become muffled and distant. Visual experiences behind your closed eyelids become softer and more abstract. The sense of your body's position and the feeling of the bed beneath you become less precisely defined. Your brain is slowly, gradually releasing its hold on perception, allowing you to drift into a different state of consciousness where dreams and sleep will soon carry you away. The wonder of multisensory integration. One of the most remarkable and soothing aspects of how your brain creates perception is that it doesn't process each sense in isolation. Instead, your brain is constantly combining information from multiple senses, weaving together sight and sound and touch and movement into a single, unified experience. This process, called multisensory integration, is happening automatically at every moment, and it's part of what makes your conscious experience feel so rich and seamless. Think about the experience of eating a meal, for example. You see the food on your plate, notice its colors and shapes. You smell its aroma rising up toward your nose. You feel the texture of the food in your mouth, the temperature, the weight of the fork in your hand. You hear the sounds of chewing, the clink of silverware, maybe conversation happening around you. And somehow, your brain combines all of these separate sensory streams into the unified experience of eating, an experience that feels like a single, integrated whole rather than a collection of separate sensations. Neuroscientists have discovered that multisensory integration happens at multiple levels in the brain. It begins surprisingly early, in areas that were once thought to process only a single sense. For decades, scientists believed that sensory processing followed a strict hierarchy, with each sense first processed independently in its own primary cortical area, and only later combining with other senses in higher-level association areas. But research over the past few decades has revealed that the boundaries between sensory systems are far more blurred than we once thought. Even the primary visual cortex, long considered to be purely visual, actually receives input from other senses. Studies have shown that neurons in V1 can be influenced by sounds and by touch, particularly when those non-visual stimuli are related to what the animal is looking at. Similarly, the primary auditory cortex receives visual input, and the somatosensory cortex receives visual and auditory information. These early interactions allow the brain to begin combining sensory information right from the start of cortical processing, rather than waiting for information to reach higher-level areas. But the most dramatic multisensory integration happens in association areas of the cortex, particularly in the parietal lobe, which is located near the top and toward the back of your head. The parietal lobe is like a sensory fusion center, receiving input from vision, touch, hearing, and your sense of body position and movement. Neurons in the parietal cortex often respond to multiple types of sensory input simultaneously. Some neurons, for instance, respond both when you see an object and when you hear a sound, particularly if the object and sound are in the same location. Other neurons respond both to visual and tactile stimulation, helping you coordinate what you see with what you touch. This multisensory integration in the parietal lobe is essential for creating your sense of where things are in the space around you. Imagine reaching out in the dark to pick up a glass of water from your nightstand. You can't see the glass, so you're relying on your memory of where it should be, your sense of where your hand is in space, and the feeling when your fingers finally make contact with the smooth surface of the glass. The parietal cortex is what allows you to coordinate all of this information, to know where your body is relative to objects in your environment, to successfully guide your movements toward goals even without vision. Research has revealed something particularly interesting about multisensory integration. When information from multiple senses is combined, the result is often more than the sum of its parts. This phenomenon is called the superadditive effect of multisensory integration. When you receive information about something through two senses instead of one, your brain's response is stronger than you would predict by simply adding together the responses to each sense individually. It's as if the combination of sensory information provides extra confirmation that something is really there, really happening, and so your brain amplifies the signal. This superadditive effect helps explain why you can better understand someone speaking to you in a noisy environment when you can see their face. The visual information from watching their lips move combines with the auditory information of their voice, and together these two sources of information allow you to perceive their speech more clearly than either sense alone would allow. This phenomenon is so powerful that there are actually interesting illusions that arise when visual and auditory speech information conflict. One famous example is called the McGurk effect. If you watch a video of someone making the mouth movements for the sound GA, while the audio track plays the sound BA, your brain will often perceive a third sound entirely, like D or they, as it tries to reconcile the conflicting visual and auditory information. This illusion demonstrates how deeply your brain integrates information from different senses. The sound you consciously hear is not purely determined by the auditory information reaching your ears. Instead, it's a construction that your brain creates by combining auditory and visual information. The way your brain combines sensory information is remarkably flexible and adaptive. It's not simply a fixed, hardwired system. Instead, your brain is constantly learning about the relationships between different types of sensory information, and it adjusts how it integrates the senses based on the reliability of each sensory source in a given situation. There's a principle called the principle of inverse effectiveness that describes one aspect of this flexibility. This principle states that you benefit more from having information from multiple senses when one of those senses provides weak or ambiguous information. If you're listening to someone speak and the sound is clear and loud, you don't gain much additional benefit from also watching their face. But if the sound is faint or there's background noise, then being able to see their face provides substantial additional help. Your brain automatically adjusts how much it relies on each sense depending on the quality of information each sense is providing. This adaptive nature of multisensory integration is beautifully calming when you think about it. Your brain is constantly working behind the scenes to give you the clearest, most accurate perception possible, automatically weighing different sources of information, seamlessly combining them in the way that will be most useful to you. You never have to consciously think about how to integrate your senses. You never have to decide how much to trust your vision versus your hearing versus your touch. Your brain handles all of that for you, moment by moment, letting you experience a unified, coherent world. As you lie here preparing for sleep, your brain is still performing this integration, but in a gentler, more muted way. The sensory information coming into your brain is becoming quieter, less insistent, and so the integration is becoming less urgent, less demanding of your attention. The sights behind your closed eyelids, the sounds in your environment, the feeling of your body resting, all of these are still being woven together, but more and more loosely, more and more gently, as your brain allows perception to recede and sleep to approach. There's something deeply peaceful about understanding that your brain creates this multisensory unity automatically, that you don't have to work at it or maintain it consciously. It simply happens naturally and effortlessly, and as you drift towards sleep, it simply continues happening in a softer, quieter register, until eventually conscious perception fades altogether and you enter the different world of dreams and deep sleep. Research has shown that multisensory integration involves coordinated activity across many different brain regions, all working together in synchronized patterns. Different parts of your visual system, your auditory system, your somatosensory system, they all need to communicate with each other to create your unified perceptual experience. This communication happens through networks of connections between brain regions, and it's coordinated by rhythmic patterns of electrical activity, brain waves that help different regions stay in sync with each other. As you transition towards sleep, these patterns of coordinated activity shift. The high-frequency, Fast rhythms that characterize alert wakefulness give way to slower, more synchronized rhythms. Your brain regions begin to communicate in a different way, less focused on processing external sensory information, more turned inward toward the internally generated experiences of dreams and sleep. This transition is gentle and gradual, a natural rhythm that your brain follows every single night, requiring no effort or attention from you. The multisensory nature of perception extends even to senses you might not think about consciously. Beyond the 5 traditional senses of sight, sound, touch, taste, and smell, your brain is also constantly integrating information from your vestibular system, which tells you about your head's position and movement, your proprioceptive system, which tells you about the positions of your limbs and the state of your muscles and joints, and your interoceptive system, which tells you about the state of your internal organs, your hunger, thirst, need to breathe, and many other internal sensations. All of this information is being combined all the time to create your complete sense of being embodied, of being a physical presence in a physical world. And even this complex, multidimensional integration happens automatically, effortlessly, allowing you to simply exist without having to consciously track all these different sources of information. Your brain does the work quietly and continuously so that you can rest, so that you can let go, so that you can drift into sleep. Optical illusions and the brain's creative shortcuts. There's something wonderfully revealing and oddly comforting about optical illusions. They show us that our perception of the world is not a simple, direct recording of reality, but rather a creative construction that our brain builds using shortcuts, assumptions, and educated guesses. Understanding how illusions work can help you appreciate just how much interpretive work your brain is doing behind the scenes, and how this work usually leads to accurate, useful perceptions even though it occasionally leads to predictable errors. When you look at an optical illusion, what you're actually seeing is evidence of your brain's normally efficient processing strategies. Your brain has evolved to make sense of a complex, often ambiguous world as quickly and accurately as possible. To do this, it doesn't wait to collect all possible information before forming a percept. Instead, it uses whatever information is available, combines it with expectations based on your past experiences and knowledge of how the world usually works, and generates a best guess about what's out there in the world. Most of the time, these guesses are remarkably accurate. Your brain's assumptions about how light works, how objects are shaped, how shadows fall, how things move through space, these assumptions are so well calibrated to the actual structure of the physical world that your perceptions are reliable guides to reality. But in carefully constructed illusions, these same assumptions can be exploited to create perceptions that deviate from physical reality, revealing the usually invisible strategies your brain is using. Consider one of the most famous optical illusions, the Knizia triangle. In this illusion, you see 3 black circles, each with a wedge cut out, arranged in a triangular pattern. Even though there are no actual lines connecting these circles, most people clearly perceive a bright white triangle sitting on top of 3 black circles, with the edges of the triangle visible even where there's nothing but white background. Your brain is literally creating contours that don't exist in the stimulus, filling in edges to make sense of the pattern you're seeing. Recent neuroscience research has revealed something remarkable about this illusion. Scientists have discovered specialized neurons in the visual cortex, called illusory contour encoders, that respond specifically when you view this type of illusion. these neurons become active even though there's no actual contour present in the image. What's even more fascinating is that these neurons are located in the primary visual cortex, V1, the earliest stage of cortical visual processing. This suggests that the brain doesn't wait for high-level cognitive processes to interpret the image. Instead, it begins creating these illusory contours right from the start of visual processing. The explanation for this involves something called recurrent pattern completion. Your brain doesn't just process visual information in one direction, from the eyes through the visual cortex to higher brain areas. Instead, there's constant communication flowing backward as well, from higher areas back down to early visual areas. When higher brain areas recognize a partial pattern, like the configuration of circles in the Kanitsa triangle, they send signals back down to earlier areas that say, in effect, these patterns usually indicate the presence of edges here and here. And those earlier areas then fill in the expected edges, completing the pattern and creating the conscious experience of seeing contours that aren't actually there in the image. This back-and-forth communication between brain areas, this interplay between bottom-up sensory signals and top-down expectations, is fundamental to how your brain creates perception. It's not a one-way street from sensation to perception, but rather a continuous conversation between different levels of processing, with each level influencing the others. And this conversation happens so quickly, so automatically, that you never notice it. You simply see the triangle immediately and effortlessly, because your brain has done all the interpretive work for you. Another class of illusions reveals your brain's assumptions about lighting and shadows. The checker shadow illusion is a particularly striking example. In this illusion, you see a checkerboard with light and dark squares, with a cylinder casting a shadow across part of the board. Two squares are labeled A and B. Square A appears much darker than square B, yet if you were to measure the actual light intensity being reflected from each square, you would discover they're exactly the same shade of gray. Your brain perceives them as different because it's making an assumption about how shadows work. It knows that shadows make things look darker than they really are. So when it sees square B sitting in the shadow, it automatically adjusts its interpretation, essentially saying, this square is in shadow, so it must really be lighter than it appears. Meanwhile, square A is not in shadow, so its apparent darkness is taken at face value. Your brain is showing you not the actual light intensities reaching your eyes, but rather its best estimate of the actual surface colors of the squares, corrected for lighting conditions. This correction for lighting conditions is incredibly useful in everyday life. It's what allows you to recognize that an object is the same color whether you see it in bright sunlight or in dim indoor lighting, even though the actual wavelengths and intensities of light reaching your eyes are completely different in these two situations. Your brain automatically factors out the illumination and shows you a relatively constant perception of surface colors. But in the checker shadow illusion, this useful correction leads to a misperception, because the setup of the illusion tricks your brain's assumptions about where shadows are falling. The fact that you continue to see this illusion even after you know it's an illusion is actually quite soothing when you think about it deeply. It means that these perceptual processes are happening at a level beyond your conscious control. You don't have to maintain them or think about them. Your brain just does this work automatically, continuously, allowing you to perceive a stable, coherent world without any mental effort. And it will continue doing this work even as you fall asleep, processing visual information in the darkness behind your closed eyelids. gradually shifting from processing external visual stimuli to generating the internal visual experiences of dreams. There are countless other optical illusions that reveal different aspects of your brain's processing strategies. The Muller-Lyer illusion shows two lines of identical length, one with arrow tails pointing inward and one with arrow tails pointing outward. The line with outward pointing tails looks longer, even though careful measurement shows they're the same. This illusion might arise because your brain interprets the lines as representing corners of three-dimensional structures, like the interior and exterior corners of rooms, and applies size constancy corrections based on perceived depth. The Ames room is a particularly dramatic three-dimensional illusion. The room is constructed with a slanted floor and walls that converge toward one corner, but when viewed through a specific peephole, it appears to be a normal rectangular room. People standing in different corners of the room appear to be dramatically different sizes, with one looking like a giant and the other like a tiny person, even though they're actually normal-sized adults. This illusion works because your brain assumes rooms are rectangular with parallel walls and level floors, and when forced to maintain that assumption while viewing the distorted room, it misinterprets the sizes of the people instead. The Necker cube is an example of an ambiguous figure that can be perceived in two different ways. It's a simple line drawing of a cube, but the cube can be seen as if you're looking down at it from above or up at it from below, with different faces appearing to be in front. Your perception spontaneously flips between these two interpretations, unable to settle on just one. This bistable perception reveals that your brain is actively interpreting the ambiguous two-dimensional image as a three-dimensional structure. And when multiple interpretations are equally valid, your perception alternates between them. Motion after effects provide another striking example of neural adaptation in the visual system. If you stare at a waterfall or other downward moving pattern for 30 seconds or more, then look at a stationary scene, the stationary scene will briefly appear to move upward. This happens because neurons in MT that respond to downward motion have adapted to the constant stimulation, reducing their firing rate. When you then look at a stationary scene, the balance of activity between downward motion and upward motion neurons is disrupted, with the upward motion neurons now relatively more active, creating the perception of upward motion even though nothing is actually moving. The Hermann grid illusion shows a white grid on a black background, and most people see dark spots appearing at the intersections of the white lines, except at the intersection they're directly looking at. This illusion is thought to arise from lateral inhibition in the retina and early visual processing. Neurons that respond to the intersections receive more inhibitory input from neighboring neurons than neurons that respond to the middle of the lines, causing the intersections to appear darker. But this explanation is still debated, and the actual mechanisms underlying this and many other illusions continue to be investigated. Color contrast effects demonstrate how the perception of color depends on surrounding colors. A gray square on a blue background appears slightly orange, while the same gray square on an orange background appears slightly blue. Your brain is adjusting color perception based on context, essentially trying to determine what the actual surface color is after factoring out the effects of colored illumination. If the whole scene has a blue tint, perhaps due to blue lighting, then your brain compensates by shifting colors in the opposite direction to try to recover the true surface colors. The flash lag effect we mentioned earlier is just one of many temporal illusions that reveal how your brain processes events in time. Another is the stopped clock illusion, where the second hand of a clock seems to pause for an extra long moment when you first look at it. This happens because your brain is filling in the temporal gap created by the saccadic eye movement you just made to look at the clock, extending your perception of the first stable image you see after the saccade. All of these illusions, and hundreds more that have been discovered and studied, reveal the normally invisible work your brain is doing to create perception. They show that perception is not passive reception but active construction, not simple recording but complex interpretation. Your brain uses assumptions, shortcuts, contextual information, and predictions to rapidly generate useful perceptions from ambiguous sensory input. Most of the time, these strategies work beautifully, giving you accurate, reliable information about the world. Occasionally, in special circumstances or carefully designed illusions, they produce systematic errors that reveal the strategies being used. Illusions involving depth perception reveal another set of assumptions your brain uses. The Ponzo illusion is a classic example. In this illusion, two identical lines are drawn between two converging lines that look like railroad tracks receding into the distance. The line that appears to be farther away looks longer than the line that appears closer, even though they're exactly the same length. Your brain is using the converging lines as a depth cue, interpreting the configuration as if you're looking down a three-dimensional corridor or track extending into the distance. In the real three-dimensional world, if two objects project the same size image on your retina but one appears to be farther away, that means the farther object must actually be larger. Your brain applies this knowledge, this assumption about how size and distance relate, and makes the line that seems farther away look larger in your perception. This reveals something profound about perception. Your brain is not content to just show you two-dimensional patterns of light hitting your retinas. Instead, it's constantly working to interpret these two-dimensional images as depicting a three-dimensional world. It uses all sorts of cues, converging lines, texture gradients, overlap, shading, motion parallax, to estimate the three-dimensional structure of the scene you're viewing. And it does this so automatically and so successfully that you rarely think about the fact that your retinal images are flat, but your perceptual experience is deeply three-dimensional. Even the way you perceive motion can be influenced by assumptions and expectations. There are illusions where stationary patterns appear to move, where motion in one direction is perceived where there's actually motion in the opposite direction, where you see motion that isn't there at all. These illusions exploit the mechanisms your brain uses to detect and analyze motion, which involve comparing patterns of activity across time and space in the visual system. One fascinating illusion is called the flash lag effect. If a moving object and a flashing object are aligned at the same moment in time, the moving object appears to be ahead of the flashing object. Your brain essentially predicts where the moving object will be by the time you become consciously aware of it, compensating for the processing delays in your visual system. In the physical world, this prediction helps you interact with moving objects more effectively. But in the carefully controlled conditions of the flash lag illusion, it creates a misperception, revealing the predictive strategy your brain is using. The neuroscientist Mark Changizi has proposed that many optical illusions can be understood as arising from your brain's attempt to compensate for the time delay between when something happens in the world and when you become consciously aware of it. It takes about 1/10 of a second for visual information to travel from your eyes to your brain and be processed enough to reach consciousness. During that 1/10 of a second, the world keeps moving and changing. So to perceive things as they are now rather than as they were 1/10 of a second ago, your brain tries to project forward in time, to show you where things will be by the time you're seeing them. This forward projection usually works well, but in unusual situations or in carefully designed illusions, it can lead to errors. And yet, even knowing this, even understanding that your perception is not a simple recording but a sophisticated prediction, you continue to perceive the world in the same way. Your brain's perceptual strategies are automatic, built into the structure and function of your visual system, operating beyond your conscious control or awareness. There's something deeply restful about understanding that perception works this way. It means you don't have to work at seeing, at interpreting your visual experience. Your brain does all of this complex processing for you, automatically and continuously, using strategies refined over millions of years of evolution. These strategies usually work beautifully, giving you accurate, useful perceptions of the world. And when they occasionally fail in the special case of illusions, they fail in predictable, consistent ways, revealing the normally invisible mechanisms at work. As you lie here moving towards sleep, your visual system is still operating, still applying these same strategies and assumptions, but with quieter and quieter input as your eyes remain closed and the outside world fades away. Your brain continues its predictive, interpretive work, but turned inward now, preparing to generate the visual experiences of dreams from purely internal sources. The same mechanisms that create your waking perception will soon create your dreaming perception, just operating in a different mode, freed from the constraint of matching external reality, weaving images from memory and emotion and random neural activity into the strange, compelling narratives of dreams. The mysterious experience of time. Of all the aspects of perception, perhaps none is more mysterious or more fascinating than your sense of time. Time is not a physical stimulus like light or sound or pressure. There's no sense organ specifically dedicated to detecting time, no temporal receptors sending time signals to your brain. And yet you clearly have a sense of time passing, an awareness of duration, a perception of the order in which events occur, a felt experience of now that distinguishes the present moment from past and future. How does your brain create this sense of time? This question has puzzled philosophers for millennia and continues to challenge neuroscientists today. What researchers have discovered is that time perception, like other aspects of perception, is actively constructed by your brain. It's not a simple, direct readout of some internal clock, but rather an interpretation created by distributed networks of brain regions working together, using multiple mechanisms operating at different timescales. For very short durations, on the order of milliseconds to seconds, time perception seems to involve the cerebellum and basal ganglia, structures deep in your brain that are also involved in controlling movement. These regions may function something like timers, using the oscillatory activity of populations of neurons to track intervals and determine when actions should be initiated or how long stimuli last. For longer durations, on the order of seconds to minutes, time perception involves the prefrontal cortex, particularly regions on the medial surface of the frontal lobe and a region called the right dorsolateral prefrontal cortex. These areas seem to be involved in consciously attending to and estimating durations, holding temporal information in working memory, and comparing intervals. The neurotransmitter dopamine plays an important role in these systems. Changes in dopamine levels can make time seem to speed up or slow down, which may help explain why time perception can be altered in conditions like Parkinson's disease, where dopamine-producing neurons are damaged. For even longer durations, hours to days to years, Time perception involves the lateral entorhinal cortex, a region located on the lower side of your brain near your ear. Researchers have discovered something remarkable in this region. It contains neurons that seem to encode time within your experiences and memories. These neurons change their firing patterns gradually but consistently as time passes during an experience, essentially providing a timestamp that marks when different events occurred. This discovery is relatively recent and quite profound. It suggests that your brain has a dedicated system for encoding the temporal structure of your experiences, for maintaining a record not just of what happened, but when it happened and in what order. This temporal encoding is crucial for episodic memory, your memory of specific events and experiences from your life. Without a sense of time, memories would just be a jumbled collection of facts and images, with no way to place them in sequence or understand their relationships to each other. But what's particularly fascinating and calming about time perception is how flexible and subjective it is. Your sense of time is not a simple, objective measure. Instead, it's constantly being influenced by your attention, your emotions, your expectations, your current state of arousal, and many other factors. Time can seem to fly by or drag on, speed up or slow down, depending on what you're experiencing and how you're experiencing it. One of the most striking aspects of time perception is that it changes as you age. Almost everyone reports that time seems to speed up as they get older. When you were a child, a year felt like forever. Summer vacations stretched out endlessly before you. But as an adult, years seem to fly by in a blur. Why does this happen? There are several theories, and they're not mutually exclusive. One idea is that time perception is related to how much new information you're processing. When you're young, everything is novel and requires attention. Your brain is encoding lots of rich, detailed memories because you're constantly encountering new situations and learning new things. In retrospect, periods of time that contained lots of rich, varied experiences seem to have lasted longer. As you get older and life becomes more routine, you encode fewer detailed memories, and time in retrospect seems to have passed more quickly. Another theory focuses on the proportional nature of time. When you're 10 years old, 1 year represents 10% of your entire life, a substantial fraction of your existence. When you're 50 years old, 1 year represents only 2% of your life, a much smaller fraction. This proportional difference might influence how long a year feels. Yet another theory involves changes in the speed at which your brain processes information. As you age, the neural networks in your brain become more complex, with more connections between neurons. Signals have to travel through this more complex network, which takes slightly longer. Additionally, neurons accumulate some damage over time, which can increase resistance to the flow of electrical signals. These factors might slow down the rate at which your brain processes information, which could make external time, which continues at the same objective pace, seem to speed up in comparison. There's something almost meditative about contemplating these ideas as you drift towards sleep. Time is not what it seems. It's not a simple, objective dimension of reality that your brain merely measures. Instead, it's a construction, an interpretation, something your brain creates using multiple mechanisms and multiple sources of information. And this construction is flexible, malleable, subject to distortion and illusion, just like other aspects of perception. Consider the phenomenon called chronostasis, perhaps the most accessible temporal illusion. Chronostasis occurs when you shift your gaze from one location to another. During the rapid eye movement called a saccade, your visual system is essentially offline, not processing the blurred motion that would otherwise be visible. When your gaze lands on a new target, there's a brief moment when your brain fills in the temporal gap, making it seem as though you've been looking at the new target for longer than you actually have. The first impression of the new target appears extended in time by up to half a second. The most common experience of chronostasis is called the stopped clock illusion. When you first look at a clock with a second hand, that first second often seems to last longer than subsequent seconds. Your brain is filling in the time gap from your eye movement, making the hand seem to pause for an extended moment. Once you've been watching the clock for a few seconds, subsequent ticks happen at their normal pace, but that first tick feels stretched out in time. This illusion reveals something important about time perception. Your brain doesn't just passively receive temporal information. Instead, it actively constructs your sense of when events occur, using whatever information is available and making adjustments to maintain temporal continuity and coherence. During the moment your eyes are moving, you would otherwise experience a temporal gap, a brief period of no useful visual information. Your brain papers over this gap, extending the perception of the first stable image you see after the eye movement to create the illusion of continuous perception. Your experience of time is also strongly influenced by attention and emotion. Time seems to slow down when you're frightened or in danger, a phenomenon sometimes called time dilation in extreme experiences. When you're intensely focused on something, time can seem to pass more slowly in the moment, though in retrospect it may seem to have passed quickly. When you're bored and not engaged with anything in particular, time can drag on, each moment seeming to last forever. These effects reveal that your sense of time is intimately connected with what you're paying attention to and how much cognitive processing you're doing. The more you're attending to the passage of time itself, the slower it seems to go. The more you're engaged in an absorbing activity that captures your attention away from time, the faster it seems to pass. Your brain doesn't have a simple, consistent clock running in the background. Instead, time perception emerges from the complex dynamics of your neural activity, influenced by all the other cognitive processes happening simultaneously. There's a comforting aspect to all of this as you prepare for sleep. During sleep, your sense of time essentially stops. You don't experience the passage of the hours you spend sleeping. You close your eyes and drift off, and then suddenly, seeming like no time at all has passed, you wake up and it's morning. The night has passed in an instant from your subjective perspective. Your brain, which creates your sense of time when you're awake, simply stops creating that sense during deep sleep, allowing time to disappear from your experience. Even as you're falling asleep now, your sense of time is beginning to dissolve. The moments are becoming less distinct, less separate from each other. Past and present and future begin to blend together. The normal temporal structure of consciousness begins to loosen and drift. This is a natural, gentle process, one that your brain knows how to do every night, letting go of time, allowing you to sink into the timeless experience of deep sleep. Your brain's various timing mechanisms, operating at different scales from milliseconds to minutes to hours, begin to shift as sleep approaches. The precise temporal coordination required for conscious perception and action becomes less important. The need to track time, to maintain temporal sequences, to distinguish past from present. All of this gradually fades as sleep takes over. Your brain continues functioning, of course, but in a different mode, one where time perception is no longer necessary or maintained. Scientists have found that there are neurons in the parietal cortex that seem to track time by gradually changing their activity patterns. Different neurons have different preferred intervals, some tracking durations of a few hundred milliseconds, others tracking durations of a few seconds. When a duration you're tracking matches the preferred interval of particular neurons, those neurons reach peak activity, signaling that the target duration has elapsed. This population of neurons with different temporal tunings allows your brain to represent and distinguish many different durations. Experiments have shown that these temporal representations are remarkably flexible and can be influenced by many factors. When you're expecting an event to occur at a particular time, neurons in the parietal and frontal cortex begin ramping up their activity as the expected time approaches, essentially counting down to the predicted moment. This anticipatory activity reflects your brain's temporal expectation and helps you prepare to respond quickly when the event occurs. The basal ganglia, a set of structures deep in the brain that are involved in movement control and reward processing, also play an important role in time perception. These structures contain neurons that fire in sequences, with different neurons becoming active at different points during a timed interval. It's as if the basal ganglia are running a kind of internal stopwatch, with the pattern of neural activity marking the passage of time. Dopamine, a neurotransmitter that's crucial for basal ganglia function, has been shown to modulate time perception in interesting ways. When dopamine levels are increased, either through drugs or through rewarding experiences, time seems to pass more quickly. When dopamine levels are decreased, as happens in Parkinson's disease, time seems to slow down. People with Parkinson's often report that tasks take longer than they expect, and they tend to underestimate how much time has passed. The role of attention in time perception cannot be overstated. When you're paying attention to time, to the passage of duration itself, time seems to move more slowly. This is why waiting for something while watching the clock is so excruciating, each second seeming to drag on. But when you're absorbed in an engaging activity that captures your attention away from time, time flies by without your noticing. The watched pot never boils, as the saying goes, precisely because watching makes time seem to slow down. This relationship between attention and time perception has been demonstrated in many clever experiments. In one classic study, participants were asked to estimate the duration of a stimulus while simultaneously performing either an easy or a difficult secondary task. When the secondary task was difficult, requiring more attention, participants underestimated the duration of the stimulus compared to when the secondary task was easy. The difficult task drew attention away from time, making the interval seem shorter. Memory also plays a fascinating role in time perception, particularly in how you remember durations after they've passed. There's an interesting asymmetry between prospective time perception, your experience of duration as it's happening, and retrospective time perception, your memory of how long something lasted after it's over. In prospective timing, when you're paying attention to time as it passes, time seems to move slowly and durations seem long. But in retrospective timing, when you look back on a period afterward, periods that were boring and uneventful seem to have passed quickly, while periods that were filled with novel, varied experiences seem to have lasted longer. This creates some paradoxes in how we experience time. A boring afternoon spent waiting in line seems to drag on forever while you're experiencing it, but looking back on it later, it seems like no time at all passed because you encoded very few distinctive memories. In contrast, a busy day filled with many different activities might seem to fly by in the moment because you're not paying attention to time, but in retrospect it seems like a long day because you encoded many distinct memories of different events. The kappa effect is another fascinating temporal illusion. When you perceive a sequence of events that are spaced differently in physical space, your perception of the time intervals between the events is influenced by the spatial intervals. Events that are farther apart in space seem to be farther apart in time as well, even when they actually occur at regular temporal intervals. This reveals that your brain integrates spatial and temporal information, using space as a cue to infer temporal relationships. The tau effect is the reverse. When you perceive events that are separated by different time intervals, your perception of the spatial distance between them is influenced by the temporal intervals. Events that are farther apart in time seem to be farther apart in space. Together, the kappa and tau effects demonstrate that space and time are not perceived completely independently, but rather your brain integrates spatial and temporal information to make inferences about the structure of events in the world. Cultural factors also influence time perception in subtle but important ways. Different cultures have different conceptions of time, different temporal orientations toward past, present, and future, and different ways of thinking about and talking about temporal relationships. Research has shown that these cultural differences can influence how people perceive and remember temporal information. Language plays a role too. The metaphors we use to talk about time, whether we conceptualize time as flowing like a river or as a landscape we move through, can influence our intuitions about temporal relationships. But these neurons can fatigue. If you repeatedly experience the same duration over and over, the neurons tuned to that duration gradually respond less strongly. This creates an interesting effect. After adapting to a particular duration, slightly different durations are perceived as being even more different than they would normally seem, dragged away from the adapted duration. Time perception is not fixed and absolute, but malleable and context-dependent. As sleep approaches, these timing mechanisms quiet down, becoming less active, less precise. The careful tracking of seconds and minutes becomes unnecessary. Time loses its structure, its grip on consciousness. And in this loosening, this letting go of temporal precision, there is deep rest, deep peace. As your brain releases one of its most constant cognitive demands, the demand to maintain temporal awareness, and allows you to drift into the timeless now of sleep. Synesthesia when senses blend. There's a fascinating phenomenon that reveals something profound about how your brain creates perception. Synesthesia, a condition where stimulation of one sense leads to automatic experiences in another sense. People with synesthesia might see colors when they hear music, taste shapes when they eat food, or experience specific colors associated with letters and numbers. These blended sensory experiences are not metaphorical or imaginative. They're genuine perceptual experiences, as real and automatic as anyone's normal perception. Synesthesia is relatively rare, affecting somewhere between 1 in 23 to 1 in 20,000 people, depending on which studies you look at and which type of synesthesia you're counting. But understanding synesthesia helps reveal something important about perception in general. The boundaries between your senses are not as clear-cut and absolute as they might seem. Even in people without synesthesia, The different sensory systems are constantly communicating and influencing each other in subtle ways. The most common form of synesthesia is called grapheme color synesthesia, where letters and numbers are perceived as having inherent colors. Someone with this type might always see the letter A as red, B as blue, 5 as green, and so on. These color associations are consistent and stable over time. If you ask a grapheme color synesthete what color the letter A is, they'll give you the same answer every time, and that answer will be the same years later. Another fairly common form is chromesthesia, where sounds trigger color experiences. A person with chromesthesia might see swirling colors when listening to music with different instruments, different pitches, or different volumes producing different colors and patterns. Some famous musicians, including Franz Liszt and Duke Ellington, are believed to have had chromesthesia, and they described how they experienced tonality and harmony in terms of colors. There are many other forms of synesthesia as well. In lexical gustatory synesthesia, one of the rarer forms, spoken or heard words trigger taste experiences. Someone with this type might taste chocolate when they hear their friend's name, or taste mint when they read a particular word. In spatial sequence synesthesia, sequences like numbers or months or days of the week are experienced as occupying specific spatial locations, arranged in complex three-dimensional mental maps. What causes synesthesia? Neuroscientists have made considerable progress in understanding this question, though the full picture is still emerging. The basic idea is that in synesthetes, there's increased connectivity between brain regions that normally process different types of sensory information. In grapheme color synesthesia, for instance, there appears to be extra connectivity between the region of the visual cortex that processes letters and numbers and the nearby region that processes color. This increased connectivity might arise in a couple of different ways. One possibility is that synesthetes are born with extraneural connections between sensory areas that most people don't have. Another possibility is that everyone is born with these connections, but in most people they get pruned away during brain development, whereas in synesthetes they persist into adulthood. Either way, the result is that activity in one sensory area can more easily spread to another sensory area, creating the blended perceptual experience. Brain imaging studies have provided support for this increased connectivity idea. When synesthetes experience their synesthetic perceptions, multiple sensory areas of their brains become active simultaneously. For instance, when a grapheme color synesthete looks at black letters on a white page, not only do the brain regions for letter processing become active, but color processing regions also activate, even though there are no actual colors in the stimulus. Researchers have also found structural differences in synesthetes' brains, particularly increased gray matter in regions involved in sensory processing. Interestingly, synesthesia tends to run in families, suggesting a genetic component. Studies have found that up to 40% of synesthetes have a close relative who also experiences some form of synesthesia, though not necessarily the same form. Researchers are working to identify the specific genes that might increase the likelihood of synesthesia, genes that probably influence how sensory brain regions develop and connect to each other. One of the most fascinating things about synesthesia is that people who have it generally don't consider it a disorder or disability. Most synesthetes report that their experiences are pleasant or at least neutral, and many say they wouldn't want to lose their synesthesia even if they could. Some synesthetes use their cross-sensory experiences as memory aids, associating information they want to remember with colors or tastes or spatial positions. Others find that their synesthesia enhances their creativity and artistic expression. Research suggests that synesthetes may indeed have some cognitive advantages. Several studies have found that synesthetes perform better than non-synesthetes on memory tasks, particularly for the types of information involved in their synesthetic experiences. Grapheme color synesthetes tend to have excellent memory for letter and number sequences. Some research also suggests that synesthetes may be more creative on average, though this finding is still being investigated and debated. But what does synesthesia tell us about normal perception in people who don't experience these cross-sensory effects? It reveals that the integration of different sensory modalities, which neuroscientists call cross-modal perception or multisensory integration, is a fundamental aspect of how the brain works. Even without synesthesia, your brain is constantly combining information from different senses to create your unified perceptual experience. Consider something called the Bubakiki effect, which demonstrates that everyone has some degree of cross-modal correspondence between different senses. If you're shown two shapes, one with rounded, flowing contours and one with sharp, angular points, and asked to choose which one is named Buba and which is named Kiki, about 95% of people will choose the rounded shape for Buba and the angular shape for Kiki. There's something about the soft, rounded sound of Buba that seems to match the soft, rounded shape, and something about the sharp, plosive sound of Kiki that seems to match the sharp, pointed shape. This cross-modal matching happens even though there's no logical or learned connection between sound patterns and visual shapes. It seems to reflect some deep correspondence in how your brain processes different types of sensory information. Some researchers think this kind of cross-modal correspondence might be related to the mechanisms underlying synesthesia, just manifesting in a weaker, less consistent form in people without clinical synesthesia. Another fascinating cross-modal effect is called the McGurk effect, which we mentioned earlier in the context of multisensory integration. When you hear the sound BA, while watching someone's lips make the movement for GA, you often perceive a third sound, like duh, as your brain tries to reconcile the conflicting auditory and visual information. This demonstrates how deeply integrated your different senses are, how visual information can completely change what you consciously hear, even though the auditory stimulus reaching your ears hasn't changed. Synesthesia also raises interesting questions about consciousness and subjective experience. Philosophers have long pondered what they call qualia, the subjective, qualitative aspects of experience. What it's like to see red, to taste vanilla, to feel pain. These subjective qualities are difficult to describe or compare between people. Synesthesia demonstrates that people can have very different qualitative experiences in response to the same stimulus. When a synesthete and a non-synesthete both look at the letter A, the synesthete has an additional qualitative experience, the color sensation, that the non-synesthete doesn't have. This reminds us that perception is fundamentally a subjective phenomenon. What you experience when you look at something or hear something or touch something is not a direct copy of the external stimulus, but rather a construction created by your brain based on your particular neural architecture and your particular experiences. Two people looking at the same scene may have somewhat different perceptual experiences because their brains are slightly different, their past experiences are different, their current states of attention and expectation are different. As you lie here moving towards sleep, your own cross-sensory integration is continuing, but more and more quietly. The different streams of sensory information reaching your brain are being woven together, but the weaving is becoming looser, less insistent as consciousness fades. The normally sharp boundaries between waking perception and dreaming perception are starting to blur. And in dreams, you'll experience a kind of synesthesia-like blending, where thoughts can become images, emotions can become sounds, memories can become sensations, all mixing together in the fluid, associative logic of the dreaming mind. There's something deeply calming about understanding that your perceptual experience is uniquely yours, constructed by your particular brain in its particular state. No one else experiences the world exactly as you do. And this unique, constructed nature of your experience means that you have some flexibility in how you relate to that experience. You're not bound by an absolute, objective perception that must be maintained. Instead, your perception is fluid, malleable, constantly adapting and changing. And as sleep approaches, it gracefully transforms into something different, preparing to take you into the alternate reality of dreams. Synesthesia shows us that the brain is capable of creating rich, vivid perceptual experiences that don't correspond to any external stimulus. The colors that a grapheme color synesthete sees aren't coming from their eyes. They're being generated internally by their brain. This is a preview, in a way, of what happens every night when you dream. Your brain can create entire worlds of sensory experience without any sensory input at all, weaving images and sounds and sensations from pure neural activity. Synesthesia and dreaming both demonstrate the brain's remarkable capacity to generate perception from within. Phantom sensations and body schema. Deep within your parietal cortex, in a strip of brain tissue called the primary somatosensory cortex, there exists a map of your entire body. This map, often illustrated as a distorted little person called a homunculus, represents the surface of your skin and the positions of your limbs and joints. Different regions of this cortical map correspond to different parts of your body, with larger regions devoted to body parts that are particularly sensitive or important for fine motor control, like your hands and face. This neural map is not just a passive representation that receives sensory signals from your body. It's an active, dynamic system that your brain uses to maintain what neuroscientists call your body schema, your brain's internal model of your body's structure, position, and boundaries. Your body schema is constantly being updated based on sensory feedback from your body, allowing you to know where your limbs are in space even without looking at them, to coordinate complex movements, to maintain your balance, to navigate through your environment without bumping into things. But here's something fascinating and somewhat mysterious. This body schema can persist even when parts of your body are no longer there. This is the phenomenon of phantom limbs, perhaps the clearest demonstration that your conscious experience of your body is not a simple, direct reflection of your physical body, but rather a construction created by your brain. When someone loses a limb through amputation, in 90 to 98% of cases they continue to feel the presence of the missing limb. They can feel it occupying space, feel it moving, even feel sensations like itching or pressure or temperature in the phantom limb. Some amputees report that they can voluntarily move their phantom limbs, feeling them bend and straighten, reach and grasp. Others report that their phantom limbs feel frozen or paralyzed in particular positions. The persistence of phantom limbs reveals something profound about body perception. Your sense of having a body, of being embodied in a physical form, comes from neural activity in your brain rather than from the body itself. When a limb is amputated, the neural networks in the brain that represented that limb remain largely intact. These networks continue generating activity patterns that your brain interprets as sensations coming from the limb, even though no sensory signals are actually arriving from the missing body part. What's even more remarkable is that people born without a limb can also experience phantom limbs. Studies have found that individuals with congenital limb deficiency, people who never had a particular limb because it failed to develop in the womb, sometimes report feeling a phantom version of the missing limb. This suggests that the body schema is not entirely learned from experience, but rather is partly built into the brain structure from birth, based on genetic programming that specifies the expected structure of the human body. This built-in body schema makes evolutionary sense. Your brain needs to be prepared to control and coordinate a human body from the moment of birth, so it makes sense that the basic map of the body would be established during brain development before birth. Experience then refines and elaborates this map, but the fundamental structure is already there, waiting to be filled in with sensory input from the body. The phenomenon of phantom limbs also reveals the remarkable plasticity of the brain, its ability to reorganize itself in response to changes in sensory input. In the somatosensory cortex, the map of the body is arranged roughly in order from head to toe, with the face represented next to the hand. When someone loses a hand, the region of the somatosensory cortex that used to process input from the hand no longer receives its normal input. Over time, neighboring regions can expand into this territory. Neuroscientist V.S. Ramachandran conducted famous studies showing that in some hand amputees, the face region of the somatosensory cortex had expanded to take over some of the deprived hand region. As a result, when these amputees' faces were touched, they not only felt the touch on their face but also felt corresponding sensations in their phantom hand. Touch on the cheek might be felt as touch on the phantom thumb, touch on the chin as touch on the phantom pinky. The brain had remapped its body representation, creating new connections that linked facial touch to the persistent phantom limb representation. This reorganization can help explain phantom limb pain, which many amputees experience. The pain can be severe and debilitating, a burning or crushing or stabbing sensation that feels like it's coming from the missing limb. Because there's no actual limb present, conventional pain treatments that work on the body often don't help much with phantom limb pain. Instead, treatments need to target the brain's representation of the limb. One remarkably effective treatment is called mirror therapy. An amputee places their intact limb in front of a mirror and moves it while watching the reflection. Because of the mirror's position, they see what appears to be their missing limb moving. This visual feedback gets integrated with the motor commands they're sending to their phantom limb, and the brain's representation of the phantom becomes more normal and often less painful. The success of mirror therapy demonstrates how visual information can update and modify the body schema. Your sense of your body integrates multiple sources of information. Proprioceptive signals from your muscles and joints telling you about limb position, tactile signals from your skin, visual information about your body's appearance and position, even motor commands from your brain to your muscles. When these different sources agree, you experience a coherent, unified body. When they conflict, strange things can happen. The rubber hand illusion is a fascinating demonstration of this. In this illusion, you place one of your hands out of sight behind a screen while a rubber hand is positioned in front of you where you can see it. An experimenter then simultaneously strokes your hidden real hand and the visible rubber hand with a paintbrush. After a minute or so of this synchronous stroking, many people begin to feel as though the rubber hand is their own hand, and they feel the touch of the brush on the rubber hand rather than on their real hand. When the experimenter suddenly strikes the rubber hand with a hammer or bends its fingers backward, people often gasp or wince, feeling a flash of concern for what they've temporarily incorporated into their body schema. This illusion shows how easily your brain can be fooled about the boundaries of your body. When visual information shows a hand being touched and you simultaneously feel touch, your brain concludes that the hand you're seeing must be your hand, even if it's made of rubber and positioned in an anatomically impossible location. The brain prefers coherent, consistent interpretations, so when it finds a way to make different sensory signals agree, it adopts that interpretation even if it's objectively wrong. Your body schema is not fixed and rigid, but remarkably flexible and adaptive. Can expand to incorporate tools you're using. Treat them as extensions of your body. Studies have shown that when you use a tool like a rake to retrieve distant objects, your brain's representation of peripersonal space, the space immediately around your body, expands to include the space you can reach with the tool. The neurons in your parietal cortex that normally respond to touch on your hand start responding to touch on the rake, as if the rake has become part of your body. This flexibility of the body schema is constantly at work, allowing you to adapt to new situations, learn new skills, coordinate your body with external objects and environments. And at night, as you prepare for sleep, this body schema begins to release its precise definition. The clear sense of where your body ends and the external world begins becomes softer, less distinct. You might experience brief sensations of falling or floating, called hypnagogic jerks, as your body schema loses its normal grounding. Proprioception, your sense of where your body parts are positioned in space, is one of the primary inputs to your body schema. Proprioceptive receptors in your muscles, tendons, and joints constantly send signals to your brain about the configuration of your body. But proprioception itself is a complex sense, involving multiple types of receptors and multiple levels of processing in the brain. Muscle spindles embedded within your muscles detect changes in muscle length and the rate of that change. Golgi tendon organs, located where muscles attach to tendons, detect changes in muscle tension. Joint receptors detect the angle and movement of joints. All of these signals are combined in the spinal cord and brainstem, then sent up to the somatosensory cortex where they contribute to your conscious sense of body position and movement. But remarkably, you can have conscious sensations of movement even in the absence of any proprioceptive input. Studies using nerve blocks have created what researchers call experimental phantom limbs in people with intact limbs. When a nerve that carries sensory information from an arm is temporarily blocked, that arm becomes completely numb, with no sense of touch or proprioception. The person can still move the arm using motor commands, but they receive no sensory feedback about whether it's actually moving or where it is. In this situation, when people close their eyes and try to move their blocked arm, they feel their arm moving even though it's not actually moving, it's paralyzed by the nerve block. Motor areas in the brain are generating sensations of movement in the absence of any sensory input, revealing that motor commands themselves can create conscious perceptual experiences of the body. This suggests that your normal sense of movement involves not just sensory feedback from your body, but also internal copies of motor commands, sometimes called efference copy, that your brain monitors to help predict and perceive your own actions. As you lie here preparing for sleep, your sense of your body is gradually becoming less precise, less insistent. The proprioceptive signals from your relaxed muscles and joints are quiet and gentle. Your body schema is loosening its definition, becoming less sharply delineated. You might feel yourself becoming larger or smaller, your limbs extending or shrinking, your boundaries becoming uncertain. This is a natural part of the transition towards sleep, as your brain releases its tight control over body perception and allows consciousness to drift away from the physical body. The feeling of your body sinking into the bed, becoming heavy and immobile, is your body schema adjusting to the state of deep relaxation. The motor systems that normally keep your body ready for action are gradually shutting down, entering the state of sleep paralysis that will keep you from acting out your dreams. Your conscious awareness of your body will fade, and you'll enter a state where dreams might present you with a different body entirely, or no body at all, or a body that transforms and shifts in impossible ways, freed from the constraints of physical reality and the normal rules of the body schema. The brain's predictive nature. One of the most fundamental principles of perception is that your brain doesn't wait for complete information before forming a percept. Instead, it's constantly making predictions about what's likely to be out there in the world, and it uses these predictions to guide and interpret incoming sensory information. This predictive nature of perception is so pervasive that some neuroscientists now think of the brain fundamentally as a prediction machine, constantly generating expectations about sensory input and then comparing the actual input to these expectations. This view of perception, sometimes called predictive coding or predictive processing, has become increasingly influential in neuroscience over the past couple of decades. The basic idea is that your brain maintains internal models of the world, built up from your past experiences and knowledge. These models generate predictions about what sensory input you're likely to receive in any given situation. When sensory information arrives, your brain compares it to the predictions. If the input matches the predictions, very little additional processing is needed. The brain can simply accept that things are as expected. But if there's a mismatch between prediction and input, this prediction error gets highlighted and analyzed, potentially leading to updates of the internal model. This predictive approach is extremely efficient. Rather than processing every detail of sensory input from scratch every moment, your brain can focus its resources on the unexpected, the surprising, the informative aspects of experience. The vast majority of sensory input that matches expectations can be processed quickly and efficiently using the predictions, while only surprising information requires deeper analysis. You can experience this predictive nature of perception in many ways. One striking example is the phenomenon of perceptual adaptation. If you stare at a visual pattern for an extended period, the neurons that respond to that pattern gradually reduce their firing rate. They adapt to the constant stimulation, becoming less responsive. This is called neural fatigue. But interestingly, this fatigue doesn't just make the pattern you've been looking at seem less intense. It also affects how you perceive other similar patterns. Researchers demonstrated this effect beautifully with duration perception. They showed participants a gray circle for a specific duration, like 450 milliseconds, repeated 30 times in a row. The neurons tuned to that particular duration gradually fatigued from the repeated stimulation. Then, When participants viewed a circle for a slightly different duration, like 500 milliseconds, their perception of that duration was distorted, pulled away from the adapted duration. The brain was essentially recalibrating what it considered normal based on recent experience, and durations that differed from the recent norm were exaggerated. This kind of adaptation occurs for many different aspects of perception. You can adapt to motion, making subsequent stationary patterns appear to move in the opposite direction. You can adapt to color, making subsequently viewed colors appear shifted in hue. You can adapt to facial expressions, making subsequently viewed faces appear to show different emotions. In each case, repeated exposure to a particular type of stimulus changes how your brain predicts and interprets subsequent stimuli. The predictive nature of perception helps explain another interesting phenomenon called the oddball effect. When you're viewing a series of similar stimuli and a different stimulus is suddenly presented, that different stimulus seems to last longer than the others. In experiments, people viewing a sequence of identical images followed by a single different image report that the different image stayed on screen longer, even though all images were presented for exactly the same duration. This happens because the unexpected stimulus requires more processing. Your brain's predictions are violated by the oddball stimulus, so it needs to engage more neural resources to analyze this unexpected event. This increased processing, the heightened attention and analysis directed at the surprising stimulus, creates the subjective impression that more time has passed, that the stimulus lasted longer. Once again, we see that your perception of the world, even your perception of something as basic as duration, is not a simple recording but an active construction influenced by your expectations and attention. The brain's predictive nature is particularly evident in speech perception. When you listen to someone speaking, your brain is not just passively receiving and decoding the sounds. Instead, it's actively predicting what words and sounds are likely to come next based on the context of the conversation, the grammatical structure of the sentence, your knowledge of the speaker's accent and speaking style, and many other factors. These predictions help you understand speech even in noisy environments where the acoustic signal is degraded and ambiguous. In fact, your brain's predictions can be so strong that they override the actual sensory input. This is dramatically demonstrated by the phoneme restoration effect. If a speech sound is deleted from a sentence and replaced with a cough or another noise, you typically don't notice that the sound is missing. Instead, you hear the complete sentence as if the sound was present. Your brain fills in the missing sound based on its predictions about what word should be there, creating a perceptual experience that doesn't match the actual acoustic input you received. This filling in is not limited to speech perception. Your brain fills in many gaps and ambiguities in sensory input based on context and expectations. You have a blind spot in each eye where the optic nerve exits the retina, but you don't perceive a black hole in your visual field. Instead, your brain fills in the blind spot with patterns and colors similar to the surrounding area, creating the perception of a continuous, complete visual scene. Visual scenes have many other kinds of ambiguities that your brain resolves using predictions and context. When you see an object partially hidden behind another object, you don't perceive it as a two-dimensional shape with a strange notch cut out of it. Instead, you automatically perceive it as a complete object extending behind the occluding surface. Your brain is predicting what the hidden part of the object looks like based on the visible portions and on your knowledge of how objects typically look. These predictive processes operate at many different levels and timescales. Some predictions are very fast, bottom-up processes that happen automatically without any conscious thought. Others are slower, top-down processes that involve more cognitive elaboration and conscious expectation. But at all levels, prediction is a fundamental operating principle of the brain, a way of making perception efficient and robust in the face of noisy, ambiguous sensory input. As you drift towards sleep, these predictive processes begin to shift and change. The tight coupling between predictions and sensory input that characterizes waking perception loosens. Your brain continues generating predictions, continues creating patterns of activity, but these predictions are less and less constrained by actual sensory input. This is the beginning of dreaming, where your brain's internal models and predictions run free, creating experiences that don't correspond to any external reality, but feel just as vivid and real as waking perception. There's something deeply restful about understanding that your brain doesn't require perfect sensory information to create coherent perception. It's designed to work with ambiguity, to make educated guesses, to fill in gaps. This means you don't have to maintain perfect control over your sensory environment to have clear, useful perceptions. Your brain adapts, predicts, fills in, and creates coherence from whatever information is available. And as sensory information fades during the transition to sleep, your brain simply adapts to that fading, gracefully shifting from externally grounded perception to internally generated dream experiences. The unity of conscious experience. We've explored many different aspects of perception, how your brain processes visual information, combines multiple senses, creates illusions, experiences time, sometimes blends senses in synesthesia, maintains a body schema, and constantly makes predictions. But there's a deeper mystery that underlies all of these processes. How do all these different, distributed activities in your brain come together to create a single, unified conscious experience? This is known as the binding problem in neuroscience. Your brain processes different aspects of perception in different places. Color is processed in one area, motion in another, shape in another, depth in another. Sound is processed in yet another area, touch in still another. All of these different processing streams are occurring simultaneously, in parallel, in specialized regions distributed across your cortex. And yet what you experience is not a collection of separate features and sensations, but a unified, coherent world of objects and events integrated across space and time. How does your brain bind all of these separate features together? How do you experience a rolling red ball as a single unified object rather than as the separate features of redness, roundness, and motion? How does your brain keep track of which features belong together and which don't when you're perceiving multiple objects simultaneously? Neuroscientists have proposed several mechanisms that might contribute to solving the binding problem. One important mechanism involves attention. When you pay attention to an object or location, that attentional focus might act as a kind of glue, binding together the different features that are being processed in different brain areas. Attention enhances neural responses throughout the brain, making neurons more responsive and more coordinated in their activity. This coordinated enhancement might be what allows different features to be bound together into unified object representations. Another proposed mechanism involves temporal synchrony, the coordinated timing of neural activity across different brain regions. When neurons in different parts of the brain are processing information about the same object or event, they might fire in synchrony, all responding at the same moment in time. This temporal correlation might be how the brain marks that different features belong together, distinguishing them from other features that are being processed at slightly different times. Research has found that neurons in the visual cortex often show synchronized oscillations at particular frequencies, especially around 40 cycles per second, sometimes called gamma oscillations. When you're paying attention to an object, neurons processing different features of that object tend to synchronize their gamma oscillations, potentially binding those features together. When you shift your attention to a different object, a different group of neurons synchronizes, binding the features of the new object. This mechanism of binding through synchrony is elegant and powerful. It doesn't require a single place in the brain where all information comes together. Instead, binding happens through the temporal coordination of activity across distributed regions. Different features remain processed in different locations, but they're bound together by the synchrony of their processing, creating a unified representation that doesn't exist in any single place but rather exists as a pattern of coordinated activity across the network. But temporal synchrony alone may not be sufficient to explain the richness of your unified conscious experience. Another important set of ideas comes from what's called the global workspace theory of consciousness. This theory proposes that consciousness arises when information becomes globally available to many different brain systems simultaneously, rather than remaining confined to local sensory processing regions. According to this theory, sensory information initially processed in specialized regions can become amplified and broadcast throughout the brain when it becomes relevant or salient enough to reach consciousness. This broadcasting makes the information available to systems involved in working memory, decision-making, language, and action planning. The global availability of information is what makes it conscious, what allows you to report on it, think about it, and use it to guide your behavior. The global workspace is thought to involve particularly strong participation from the prefrontal cortex and parietal cortex, which have widespread connections to many other brain regions. When these areas become strongly active in response to sensory input, they can broadcast that information back to sensory areas and forward to motor and executive areas, creating a state where the information is globally shared across cognitive systems. This global sharing might be what creates the feeling of a unified conscious experience that can encompass many different types of content simultaneously. Yet another perspective on consciousness and unified perception comes from what's called the inferential or predictive coding account. According to this view, conscious perception arises from the brain's process of making inferences about the causes of its sensory input. The brain doesn't just passively receive sensory signals. Instead, it actively models the world, generates predictions about what sensory input it should receive, and then compares its predictions to the actual input. Consciousness might arise from the iterative process of refining these predictions, resolving prediction errors, and updating internal models. In this framework, the unity of conscious experience comes from the fact that the brain maintains coherent, self-consistent models of the world. Different aspects of perception need to fit together into a single, unified model because they're all part of the same world, the same causal structure that's generating sensory input. The brain's drive toward coherent, self-consistent models might be what creates the sense of experiencing a unified world rather than disconnected fragments. All of these theories emphasize that consciousness and unified perception emerge from the coordinated activity of large-scale brain networks rather than from any single brain region. There's no single place where perception comes together, no central viewing station where all information arrives to be experienced. Instead, consciousness is a property of the whole brain working as an integrated system, with information flowing between regions in complex patterns, synchronized activity binding features together, and globally broadcast signals making information available across cognitive domains. As you lie here transitioning towards sleep, these networks that create unified conscious perception are gradually becoming less coordinated, less synchronized, less globally connected. The strong, long-range connections between frontal and parietal areas and sensory areas are weakening. The synchronized oscillations that bind features together are slowing and becoming more irregular. The global broadcasting of information is decreasing, making experience more local, more fragmented, less unified. This is not a sudden collapse but a gradual fading, a gentle dissolution of the normal structure of waking consciousness. You might experience brief fragments of thought or imagery, disconnected from each other, no longer bound into a coherent narrative. Your sense of self might become less distinct, less clearly defined. The boundary between you and the world might become less sharp. Eventually, you'll transition into deep sleep, where consciousness in the usual sense may largely disappear. But in dream sleep, a different kind of consciousness will emerge, one where the normal rules of perception are suspended, where impossible things can happen, where the logic is associative and emotional rather than literal and physical. Your brain will still be generating rich, vivid experiences, but freed from the constraint of having to match external reality, freed to create and explore without the usual boundaries. There's something profoundly peaceful about understanding that consciousness is not a thing you have to maintain or protect. It's a process that arises naturally from the activity of your brain, and it transforms naturally into different states as your brain shifts into different modes of operation. Falling asleep is not a loss or a failure but a transformation, a change in how neural networks coordinate their activity, leading to different forms of experience and ultimately to the deep rest of dreamless sleep. Your brain knows how to do this transformation. It does it every night, automatically and reliably, guided by ancient neural mechanisms refined over hundreds of millions of years of evolution. You don't have to work at it, don't have to figure out how to make it happen. You just have to allow it, have to let go of the effort of maintaining waking consciousness, and let your brain follow its natural rhythm into sleep. The different theories of consciousness we've discussed, attention and synchrony and global workspace and predictive coding, they all converge on the idea that consciousness involves coordinated, widespread activity across brain networks. And all of them predict that as this coordination decreases, as networks become less synchronized and less globally connected, consciousness will fade. This is exactly what happens as you fall asleep, and it happens gently, gradually, naturally, carrying you into rest. Let sleep come. And so we come to the end of our journey through the mysteries of perception, through the remarkable ways your brain creates your experience of reality. We've seen how sensation becomes perception through elaborate processing hierarchies, how multiple senses weave together into unified experience, how optical illusions reveal the brain's creative interpretive strategies, how time itself is a construction rather than a simple dimension, how synesthesia shows the fluidity of sensory boundaries, how phantom limbs demonstrate the primacy of the brain's body schema, how prediction shapes every moment of perception, and how consciousness emerges. From coordinated networks of neural activity, all of these processes, all of this complexity, continues as you lie here now, but more and more quietly, more and more gently. Your brain is not stopping, but it is shifting, transforming, preparing to enter the different reality of sleep and dreams. The external world is fading from your awareness, not because it has changed, but because your brain is changing how it processes information, releasing its grip on external perception, turning inward. Let this happen. Let the transformation continue. Your brain knows how to sleep. It has done this thousands of times before, and it will guide you through the transition naturally and safely. All you need to do is relax, let go, stop trying to maintain waking consciousness, and allow sleep to come in its own time. Feel your body heavy and still against the bed. Notice how your breathing has become slow and regular, happening on its own without any effort. Notice how thoughts are becoming more distant, more dreamlike, less tethered to the waking world. Notice how time is losing its structure, moments flowing into each other without clear boundaries. This is sleep approaching, consciousness transforming, perception fading into the warm darkness of rest. If you've enjoyed learning about perception tonight, consider liking this video and subscribing to Deep Science Sleep for more calming explorations of science to fall asleep to. But for now, just rest. Just breathe. Just let sleep carry you away. Good night.